Alright, so we had an absolutely wild report drop a couple days ago exposing just how absolutely brutal and criminal the police can be here in the United States. So here from The Guardian, they say hunted 1 in 3 people killed by US police were fleeing, data reveals. So let's get into some of the details here. They say nearly 1/3 of people killed by US police since 2015 were running away, driving off, or attempting to flee when the officer fatally shot or used lethal force against them, data reveals. And they say in the past 7 years, police in America have killed more than 2,500 people who were fleeing, and those numbers have slightly increased in recent years, amounting to an average of roughly 1 killing per day of someone running or trying to escape, according to Mapping Police Violence, a research group that tracks lethal force cases. Okay, 1/3 of the people who the US police are killing are running away or attempting to flee. Okay, absolutely no justification whatsoever for lethal force in these instances. And they say, again, that is an average of 1 per day, not just in killing of American citizens, but killing people who are actively trying to escape, which is criminal. Okay, that is considered to be, unnecessary use of force at the very least, or even murder in some cases. So they continue saying, in many cases, the encounters started as a traffic stop, or there were no allegations of violence or serious crimes prompting the police contact, and some people were shot in the back while running, and others were passengers in fleeing cars. So again, I mean, the origins of this are just as important as like the final outcome, because this is a result of over-policing and the police state that we have here in the United States, right? Even in the wake of the single largest civil rights protests in American history, after US police killed George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, even after that, they are still getting record police budgets. I mean, is there any other profession in the entire world? I mean, think about if doctors had a rate of 33% or 1/3 of killing their patients intentionally. I mean, we would start to probably rethink the institution of medicine a little bit if that was the case, right? But in the case of the police officers, they do this and they end up with inflated police budgets. They end up with raises. They end up with promotions. But that's just the nature of US policing here. Absolutely no accountability whatsoever. And they're going to get to a little bit more details in terms of the lack of accountability here in a second. But they continue saying 2 recent cases have sparked national outrage and protests. In Akron, Ohio, on June 27th, officers fired dozens of rounds at Jayland Walker, who was unarmed and running when he was killed. I covered this on this channel, but this was really just one of the most brutal killings that I've seen in years, really, because they fired upwards of 90 rounds at Jayland Walker while he was running away in an open parking lot. There was no indication whatsoever that he was actively posing a threat to them. He was unarmed at the time of his death, and still they decided to actively connect with over 60 bullets and fired over 90 rounds at Jayland Walker. Just completely fucking unnecessary and brutal, but that was just one instance recently. And they say also last week, an officer in San Bernardino, California, exited an unmarked car and immediately fired at Robert Adams as he ran in the opposite direction. So again, this is just fucking terrorism. I mean, let's call it what it is. This is a fascist police state that uses total impunity and the defense that they have from the police unions, from the district attorneys, from the mayors in their various cities, and they use the power that they have to have absolutely no accountability whatsoever, so that they can go around jumping out of unmarked cars. In many cases, these are plainclothes officers as well, but even in the cases where they're fully kitted out, I mean, they feel as though they have a justification, which they kind of do under the legal standards as they currently are right now, but they have a justification if they feel even mild danger in any situation. If they ever feel stressed, if they ever feel anxious about a situation, they have the right to murder American citizens with impunity, okay? So it's just completely fucking ridiculous. But they continue saying, despite a decades-long push to hold officers accountable for killing civilians, prosecution still remains exceedingly rare, the data shows, and of the 2,500 people killed while fleeing since 2015, only 50 or 2% have resulted in criminal charges. 2%, okay? And they say the majority of those charges were either dismissed or resulted in acquittals, which means only 9 officers were convicted, representing 0.35% of cases. So again, this complete bullshit narrative surrounding reforming the police and instituting, they just need more training and stuff. This isn't a training issue, okay? You don't need training to understand that you shouldn't be firing, in the case of Jayland Walker, but in any of these cases, dozens and dozens of rounds at people who are running away. I mean, just completely fucking ridiculous. But this is a problem with the institution of policing. It's not a problem with a few bad apples. This is a situation where the entire institution of policing in this country is centered around prioritizing protecting the interests of the wealthy, protecting private capital, and doing absolutely nothing to actually protect and serve individual communities. But that's just the nature of US policing here. But again, Absolutely insane. 0.35% of cases resulted in actual criminal charges for these police officers. Out of 2,500, only 9 of them were actually convicted of something, and who knows how long they're actually going to spend in jail, or whether or not they're going to serve out their full sentences. But they continue down here with a little bit more detail, saying the U.S. police kill more people in days than many countries do in years, with roughly 1,100 fatalities a year since 2013, and the numbers haven't changed since the start of the BLM movement, and they haven't budged since George Floyd's murder inspired international protests in 2020. If anything, they've just doubled down on supporting the police in any circumstances whatsoever. But they say the law has for years allowed police to kill civilians in a wide variety of circumstances. In 1985, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that officers can use lethal force against a fleeing person only if they reasonably believed that the person was an imminent threat. But the court later said that an officer's state of mind and fear in the moment was relevant to determining whether shooting was warranted, and that means a killing could be considered justified if the officer claimed that he feared the person was armed or saw them gesturing towards their waistband, even if it turned out the victim was unarmed and the threat was non-existent. So again, the entire policing strategies that they have right now are based on the assumption that if they, in a completely subjective manner, feel as though their life is threatened or their safety is threatened, they have authority to use lethal force. And again, if it's 100% based on the officer's state of mind and they are going around killing people, who doesn't have a voice in that circumstance? The person who was just killed. So you have one person giving a testimony, and it's based on entirely subjective measures on whether or not they somehow internally felt a threat, even in the cases where one was verifiably non-existent. But this is how police officers get away with not being actually charged or serving time for these types of things. But of course, they also point out that Black Americans are disproportionately affected, making up 32% of individuals killed by police while fleeing, but only accounting for 13% of the U.S. population, so triple the rate there. And they say Black victims were even more overrepresented in cases involving people fleeing on foot, making up 35 to 54% of those fatalities. So again, I mean, you can see it in the data here. This is obviously racially motivated in lots of circumstances, but this is also police having the authority to just go around and harass random innocent Black people, and then getting themselves into a situation where they escalate to use of force, and then they start to panic and they use it as a justification to shoot people. So I mean, none of these things are necessary. And again, they're talking about up here how a large percentage of these killings started with just traffic stops or like completely non-violent situations that never had to escalate, and they only ended up escalating because these police feel as though they have the impunity to escalate these situations and then to inevitably resort to lethal force if they start to feel uncomfortable. But I mean, this is nothing new. This shouldn't really be anything surprising. But we had the recent Uvalde mass shooting down in Texas, where police put on a full display and demonstrated how little they care about actually protecting and serving their communities. I mean, this is a city that had 40% of their budget donated to the police, right? They have SWAT teams, they have all of this military grade equipment. There were 400 officers who were at the scene while there was still an active shooter in the school building. They refused to go in for like over an hour, and you're left with dozens of dead children on your hands and 0 police officers that were actually seriously injured or died during this entire event. So I mean, this is the nature of the U.S. police. Again, they don't exist to protect and serve your communities. They exist to protect and serve the interests of private capital. But this was just one example of some of the dramatic failings of police responses to actual violent situations. I mean, this was a circumstance where like everybody across the board, independents, Democrats, Republicans, leftists, whatever, all agreed that use of violent, deadly force in this situation was 100% justified, and yet when it comes to a situation where it's justified, they're extremely hesitant to do it. And why is that the case? It's because they care more about their own personal safety, they care more about their own personal well-being than they do about members of the community. So I mean, they put this on full display as an example with the Uvalde shooting. But we also had this one, which I didn't get a chance to cover. I didn't really see many people cover this, but just another example about how absolutely careless cops can be with a complete disregard for like average civilians' lives. So police in Denver literally did a mass shooting just a couple of weeks ago. So So here from Business Insider, they say Denver police opened fire into a crowd, injuring 6 bystanders while going after a suspect who never fired a gun. So again, in the in the motivation of going after somebody who they perceive maybe could be down the line a potential threat, they end up shooting 6 people. I mean, this is literally a police mass shooting, a police instigated mass shooting in Denver, and yet again, no accountability whatsoever. I mean, a lot of the people who were shot in this instance literally didn't even find out that it was the police that shot them until the local news stations started covering it from that angle. So I mean, again, just complete impunity. And also, we do know the statistics on how accurate police are. They're roughly like 40% accurate with the shots that they end up firing in these circumstances. So I mean, just completely unreliable, both in the sense that they're not willing to put their lives on the line to actually protect public safety, but also in the sense that they have a complete disregard for like bystanders or average civilians who happen to be in the line of fire while they are going and tackling their suspects or shooting their suspects in this instance. But I think it's also important to point out how this plays in the larger narrative surrounding police in this country, because again, even in the wake of the largest civil rights movement in U.S. history with the BLM protests in 2020, even with that, we still have record amounts of police budgets that are being pushed forward right now, and we also have a media and a Democratic establishment, a Republican establishment that are vehemently pushing the idea that there is some sort of a mass crime wave that is taking over the United States. Now, granted, there has been some slight increases in violent crimes in some cities around the country, but it is completely blown out of proportion by our politicians and by our media. And just to hammer that home here, from Scott Hetchinger, he says, "This is astonishing yet not surprising. If it feels like you're far less safe in New York City than ever before, it's not because shootings are up, it's because the media, fueled by lies and fear-mongering by New York City Mayor Eric Adams, a cop himself, is up. Look at this chart. Red line is shootings and gray is the media." And I mean, you can see it here. I mean, I'm kind of blocking it here in the corner a little bit, but you can see it here in terms of like where the actual number of shootings is. I mean, it's basically perfectly in line to where it was in January of 2019. It's like roughly at this level. And then the media coverage since New York City Mayor Eric Adams took office is absolutely blowing up. And so you have this situation where the media is rallying around the idea that like defund the police, and that slogan somehow bankrupted all of these different police forces around the country, and that's why we have a massive increase in crime. Well, first of all, we don't even have a massive increase in crime relative to where it's been like back in the 90s or the early 2000s, but even the extent to which we did have a slight uptick in some violent crimes in some cities around the country, maybe that has a little bit more to do with the fact that we just went through a pandemic and an economic crisis, where we know that economic material conditions have much more of a correlation to crime than basically anything else. So I mean, even the explanations that they're trying to come up with to justify pushing this crime wave narrative are complete bullshit. And again, I mean, the data here bears that out perfectly. But still, again, we have a Democratic establishment with people like New York City Mayor Eric Adams and people like Joe Biden himself, who are still pushing for record police budgets. I mean, we even had this one. I covered this on this channel just a couple of weeks ago, but Biden urges cities to spend COVID relief money on police and crime prevention. So again, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, this data is pretty fucking wild, but it still shouldn't be that surprising to anybody who understands how the U.S. police operate on a regular basis. But this is just what they are. I mean, they are as brutal as it comes. They don't give a single solitary shit about putting their lives on the line to actually protect innocent civilians. They care much more about, protecting the interests of the police unions, protecting each other and having each other's backs, even in the cases where they commit, violent murders in a lot of these instances. So, I mean, this is just what the U.S. police have to offer you. They don't protect and serve your communities. They protect and serve the wealthy. And I think that this type of data perfectly bears that out.